Welcome back. In our previous video, way back last year in Lent, we looked at Paul's instructions on marriage here in chapter 7. Today we're going to look at the rest of the chapter, in which Paul ruminates on the call to marriage in a changing world. But before I start, I want to read something from St. Peter's second letter. He says, "So also our beloved brother Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom given to him, speaking of this as he does in all of his letters. There are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and the unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures." Peter recognizes the fact that some of Paul's writings are obscure and hard to understand. I bring this up because we're about to enter into one such area in 1 Corinthians. In fact, I would say there are 3 places in 1 Corinthians which I call his Inexplicables. These are passages which commentators for the past 2,000 years have looked at them and said, what on earth is going on here? So when we go through these, I want to list off a few theories of what each one might mean, but I'm in no way capable of explaining it. So, let's get started. Starting in verse 17. "Let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the scars of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when you were called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself to the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman in the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant to Christ. You were bought at a price. Do not become bondservants to men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God." In this section, Paul talks about remaining the way you are when you become a Christian. Maybe you can imagine how confused people were in the early days of Christianity. The faith was new. Gentiles and slaves were coming into it. What are they supposed to do? Paul is going to talk about circumcision way more in Galatians and Romans, but here he sums it up. The uncircumcised Gentiles don't need to get circumcised to be like the Jews. And if you already are circumcised, there's nothing wrong with that. Then Paul addresses slaves and tells them that they likewise can stay in that state of life, but if they have the opportunity, they can seek freedom. The key takeaway here is that the Christian faith isn't for any particular nationality, economic status, or social state. Anybody whose lifestyle doesn't revolve around immorality can become a Christian with minimal changes. Now Paul is going to address the people who are married and engaged to be married. "Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that, in my view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you of that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they have none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as those who had no goods, and those who deal with the world as those who have no dealing with it. For the present form of this world is passing away." All right. And here it is, the first of Paul's 3 inexplicables in his letters. Let's talk for a moment about why this is such a difficult passage. Marriage, as you know, is a sacrament in the church. It is necessary for the continuation of a Christian society. And yet, in this passage, you have Paul advising single people to remain unmarried because of the present distress and because of the appointed time growing short, and the present form of the world is passing away. What's this supposed to mean? And whatever this indicates, he says that married people should live as though they're not married because of it. And a bunch of other people should live as though they're not doing what they're currently doing. Well, what time is growing short? What is the present distress that Paul is referring to? Why does it justify remaining single and married people acting as if they're not married? I want to give 3 perspectives on this. First, the present distress that Paul has in mind is the end of the world. There are 2 benefits to this theory. First, it sure sounds like that's what he's talking about when he says that the appointed time is growing short and the present form of the world is passing away. The other benefit is that it makes good sense of Paul's advice. if the world was about to end, there wouldn't be much point in starting a family or growing a family. Any child born into that time period would experience the hardship of the end times during infancy and then get swept up in the final judgment. Similarly, there's no point in starting a business if the end of the world is imminent. So instead, Paul wants his readers to remain undistracted and unburdened during those times. The difficulty with this reading is that Paul says the appointed time is growing short as he delivers this advice to the Corinthians. That means he expects this advice to become relevant to those people and before very long. Well, here we are 2,000 years later and the end of the world hasn't happened, so that's awkward. So if you're going to take this explanation, you need to grapple with the implications of Paul being really, really wrong in his expectation of when the end of the world is going to happen. Can this letter still be said to be inspired and inerrant if one of Paul's stated assumptions is so wrong? The second theory regarding what Paul is doing here is that he's referring to anticipated persecution of the early church. So, Paul has some sense that there would be widespread persecution of Christians. In light of this, Paul thinks that Christians should minimize their worldly attachments. Going through persecution is bad, after all, but doing it with children who might be threatened to get you to comply with the authorities. Likewise, there'd be no point in starting a business if you're going to have to go into hiding soon. The downside to this theory is that it makes less sense of what Paul is saying. The present form of the world is passing away, he says. That simply sounds like the end of the world. You could say that Paul sees the world passing away from a pagan one to a Christian age and anticipates persecutions along the way, but then people are still going to need to have families and businesses if they're going to see that Christian age come about. So yeah, this theory could work, but there's still some unanswered questions. The last theory is that this is something which is true generally about the Christian life. That's probably the most non-literal of all the interpretations. Under this interpretation, Paul's recommendation that married people act as if they aren't and merchants act as if they're not in business are about attitudes towards this life. It's about having a detached attitude to these things which looks forward to the next life as the thing that's truly important. It might go without saying, but the difficulty of this interpretation of the passage is that you almost have to ignore what Paul is saying and take it entirely non-literally. Okay, so which of these theories do I like the best? Myself, I view the third option as sort of a cop-out, so it's between the first two. And while I think the middle option seems to solve most of the issues simultaneously, my heart tells me that Paul thinks he's talking about the end of the world. That does raise tricky questions about the doctrine of inspiration, but I think those can be dealt with, just not in this video. So let's move on. Verse 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried and the betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks he is not behaving properly towards his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let him marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined that this is his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, but he who refrains from marriage will do even better. Okay, if you recall, back in the beginning of this chapter, Paul was recommending celibacy to Christians who are presently single. In this last section, Paul explains his motives for that. He says married people need to be anxious about worldly affairs in a way single people are not. And as a married man myself, I certainly find that to be true. There have been times where I wanted to just write Bible commentaries and prepare for the next youth ministry event, but that isn't going to pay the bills. I have to think about money and stuff. Paul specifically says he's not trying to lay down a restraint on people. So he's not establishing some kind of rule to be followed. He's just giving advice. And his advice is that as many people who can handle the single life ought to take it. That said, the life Paul is talking about isn't singleness for its own sake. He wants that singleness to be devoted to the things of the Lord. So, if you have some guy who is pleased as punch to remain single but just plays video games in all of his spare time, that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about remaining single for the sake of Christian ministry, and this only if the person has his or her passions under control and the desire for a spouse or children won't get you into any trouble. Myself, I think this is the exception, not the rule. When I'm talking to young people, my discernment advice is that unless you are certain you are called to this sort of life, then you should go get married. In the Catholic world, it is common to talk about a vocation crisis, with not enough people being called to the priesthood or the religious life, and people try to tackle that problem head on. Myself, I think that's the wrong approach. In my mind, the real crisis is a marriage crisis. It's about getting Catholics to get married and form generously sized Catholic families. Solve that problem, and I think the vocation crisis will solve itself. But that's just my take. And with that, we're done with Chapter 7. See you next time.